So, welcome back to the second session of me mixing the tune by a central New York based band called Nerd Therapy, and the song is called Tour de Force. So, in the first session, we talked about things like gain staging and phase and what you're looking for and how to make a good starting point when you then turn around and set some levels and set up your pans. I wanted to offer one point of clarification around what I said regarding how I pan things and how I exclusively do left, right, and center. There is one area where I will pan to what the listener hears, and that's when you have analog, i.e., multi-tracked drums, and I will pan that to the way it sounds to a listener, or the way it sounds as if you were sitting in that throne and drumming. Therefore, kick and snare are center. Overhead mics get panned usually hard left, hard right. A room mic fits into the spectrum somewhere panned leftish, rightish, depending on where it sounds the best. And rack toms will end up getting panned a little bit left, a little bit right, and far right if you have two rack toms and a floor tom. And then I'll fit a hi-hat in, usually maybe 50% left and a ride, 50% right, depending on the way the kit's been set up. So again, the left, right, center works for the song, but I wanted to clarify that one point around, pan in a way that makes sense, as if you're sitting in an audience watching a band, do it that way. So I wanted to start off this session by going back to this reference track. I only really talked about it in the first session in the context of, here's my reference track. Here is how I've lined up all the tracks around it. But what I want to do is play through it. Now, in looking at the track here and looking at it here in this console, you see I've soloed it and it's going out to main. And as you recall, main has no processing taking place. So I want us to listen to it. And I want to, since we're about to flesh out all the instruments other than drums and bass, I want to talk to you about why I made decisions around panning. And I want to call out a couple things where in a jam band kind of performance where a lot of people are expressing themselves musically, and I respect that because I've probably played hundreds of shows at this point in my life, and at times things don't work. And no matter how much you try to fit them into a song, they don't. And to my ears, and I'm not putting down anyone in the band, to my ears, things didn't sound right. So I had to make a musical decision as to how to showcase all the people who stuck their necks out and played on this tune, but also I wanted to be able to make a cohesive final mix, which I had mentioned early in the last session. So let's listen to the reference track for a minute or so. Then I'll show you some problem areas that I picked up on where there were things that just didn't fit, and I was trying to figure out what to do with, and then I had to look at dominant parts, and we're going to build the mix, or the way I built the mix was around 3 dominant parts, and I'll call those out after we've given this a listen, and I've called some things out that I knew I had to work with. So let's get into it. Okay, so that was our starting point. And out of the gate, the first couple of times I listened to this reference track the band provided for me, I knew it was on the right track. I thought that a couple things were really neat. And I'm just going to play the beginning again and tell you some things I wanted to keep when I worked on the mix myself. So let's just play, and I'll explain the markers in a second. Let's just play up until chorus 1, and I'll tell you what was neat to me and things where I was like, let's recapture this in my version of the mix. Okay. The one thing that really stuck out to me is that there's this, I call it a backbone part of the song. And I had talked about the swirl and the eerie and the organ in the first session, but this organ was neat. I really liked the way it was hard panned. It was right channel for me at least. And I thought, yeah, let's do the mix that way because you have this driving bass and you have these drums and you have this swirl part that is really featured in the chorus. And I'm going to come to that now. And I'll tell you what my thinking was before I started setting levels or anything, simply by just listening to what they gave me. So here's what works. I'll talk about that first. Here is where I had some challenges and I had to make a musical decision. So here we go. All right, so as I mentioned in the first session, I really like the chorus on the song. This is hooky like crazy. And when you listen to a song probably hundreds of times during a mixing session or sessions, if you don't like the song, it makes it really hard. Here, I really like the hooks. I really like the instrumentation. But what I found in the beginning of the chorus, in the left channel, there's a part that is kind of playing on time, but to my ears, it didn't sound like it was playing in key. And I had to make a decision around what to do with it because in the first half of the part, I didn't feel it worked. So somewhere between where I put these markers in and what these mean is I listened to the song a bunch of times against between the reference track and all these tracks. I put in markers so I'd know where parts were coming in. And I knew then when I wanted, once I came to the point of drawing automation, which I'll come to in this session, where I needed to bring things in and bring things out based on what's the dominant part, what is serving the song, and what do I need to make a decision around given, is it off key, is it off time, is it not, does it not, at least to my ears, make sense? So in the first part of the chorus, there's this part and it didn't work for me. So let's play that again and I'll show you what I ended up doing in the mix for this. So around the 15th measure here, the part really resolves into something that I thought was really cool. So I wanted to get rid of, based on the musical decision I made around mixing this, get rid of the part that to my ears didn't fit, but then it kind of mellows out a little bit and falls into a pocket, and I just wanted it to be an accent in the mix. So let's listen to this and then listen to it until it gets to part two, but that's something we'll come back to as we are working through the mix. Cool. So what I decided to do here was as follows. The part that's making the ba-dum-bum, ba-dum-ba-dum-bum, we can listen to it in the mix here. And I'm going to start from the place where I thought to myself, yeah, this is really cool because I like the swirl effect on this. In fact, let me get rid of this reference track here, just mute that up. And let's just start looking at the mix as I had already built the foundation with drums and bass, but now I'm trying to figure out what to do with all the rest of the instrumentation. So I just want to hear the swirl bus, and I want to hear it from where I wanted it a little bit in the song, but I wanted really the organ, which was an anchor part. Everything was on time, everything was in key, and yet the swirl part made sense to my ears because it just fit. And it was a cool accent where when you listen to it with headphones or in a car or wherever, it kind of pokes through in the left channel, and I thought it was something we wanted to keep. So here we go. And that part carries through into what I call part two of the song. I didn't know if I was going to call it verse two, whatever. I mean, I was just trying to make markers so I knew where I was when I was mixing. So here you see a swirl bus, and here you see the swirl tracks. One is soloed, one is muted. As I talk about drawing in automation in a little bit, uh, sometimes I play both of these with different levels just to bring a balance into the mix, in particular if that's the dominant element at that part of the song. So I added some inserts here. I started with the Kramer tape. I went with the whirly keys because I felt that for something that has a flanginess, I wanted to capture some of the panning from left to right or right to left, depending on where things were in the mix. I felt this patch worked perfectly, and I adjusted the levels based on, in equals out. Then I went to the virtual mix rack, and I chose a piano. Now, obviously, I made some modifications. I dropped out everything at 20 hertz. There's no reason to keep stuff like this. I mean, someday if you want to make a mix for dogs who can hear everything, 20 hertz, they'd probably be delighted. They'll be like, this is the best mix I have ever heard. But for humans, generally speaking, we don't hear this stuff, and it creates just blah in the mix. So I could have probably gone higher. I went with 20 here, and you'll see later on I cut even at a higher level. So I gave at 160. I found this neat thing frequency-wise as I swept around here. At 160-ish, it's like I think 164 or so, and I gave dB a boost to it. I just thought it was where there's a sweet spot in this swirly thingy, swirly instrument, whatever it's called. I left this band alone. I did it around 7.5K, a boost around 1.5, maybe 2 dB. And then I use this FGN, which is also part of Slate. This is all Slate stuff. I ended up choosing to drop everything, like make this high pass filter at 160 hertz. There was a lot of stuff in the swirl instrument where I felt it just doesn't serve the song, and it creates muddiness and lack of clarity, and it was screwing with the bass, and it bugged me. So I figured when I played everything together, you really can't tell that I made the cut because, again, you mix in context. I didn't really do that much else here except for this really aggressive cut. Now here, there's this thing called the FG stress. It's a compressor of sorts, or a distressor, I think you'd call it that. It's very similar to its hardware counterpart. We're doing 4-to-1 ratio. I basically took a preset, and the gain reduction was hammering it, and I made it less aggressive. For revival, I just added a little bit of shimmer, a little bit of thickness, and then again, in equals out, and that's how I use trimmer. Now here's one interesting, and I didn't use this in the shout out before. This is from Ozone, and this is a freely available plugin called Imager 2. You just have to sign up for it. If memory serves, I forget whether or not you have to use an iLock for it, but be that as may, you have an iLock, it's free. It'll take care of itself. You might have to update it every year. But what I did with this is I wanted extreme width in the mix because I want this mix to be wide. And that's the one thing I didn't hear in the reference track, and it's the one thing I wanted to add to this tune. So what you're hearing is processed. And then you see here that there's something called swirl wide. And what swirl wide does, and you see that here, is I wanted this really to feature itself by being panned into the mix. So what we are doing is we're setting a 1/16th note delay between left and right channels, and you'll get that left and right movement. So let's listen to that the way that is right now, and like first without, then with. Okay, here we go. And now with. So what you hear on that is this ping-ponging effect between left and right channel where it ping-pongs from left to right and does this echo in the right channel. I really like that. I think, and I did this again in context and mix, and it worked because I had to balance these two channels as well as possible, and that totally worked. Now, here we have this thing called the Erie bus, and that Erie sound, like I said, it's kind of like the slasher flick kind of thing where you hear this kind of sad sounding ambient tone, I guess is the best way I can put it. And I wanted to do something similar with it using the same repeater plugin from, well, it's part of Slate, but technically speaking, I forget the vendor it's from now, but it's included in the Slate bundle, and it just does some really neat stuff with delay and really helps out when you're mixing to bring some depth and width to the mix. So let's see if that's in the chorus. I don't recall. In fact, yes, if we bring this reference track back in, you'll hear that this part really didn't work in context. So I started featuring it where it really made sense in the song. Here it is. So here it is by itself. You'll see that I panned this. I'm actually playing the right panned track, and it's coming to this bus. So I added this width to it using this repeater again. And what I did was, let's play this briefly and I'll explain. This has the same kind of ping-ponging thing going on, kind of. But it's doing this left, right, left, right, left, right kind of movement in the speakers or the headphones or whatever. I really like that because I think it musically it fit with what I did with the swirl. So let's listen to it again. I'll take it out. I'll put it back in. Then I'll put everything back in. Now in. And you'll see there was some fluctuation in level here. As I get to automation, I'll explain why you're hearing things by themselves that sounds a little off, where when you listen to the mix, you don't hear it. But in the meantime, let's just listen to this in context with both the swirl bus and the Erie bus and Erie wide and swirl wide all doing their thing. Okay, so that did what I wanted it to do. So now let's focus on the organ. I mentioned that organ and bass and drums were the dominant elements, and I wanted to build a mix around it because they were the most consistent elements when you listen to the entire song. I said, all right, this makes sense from an accent standpoint, and there's also a neat solo later in the song that I wanted to showcase. So if we take a look at this chain here and we solo this track because we're going to want to listen to it just to see what I did to it. Here, I used an electric guitar preset. To my ears, it sounded like what we wanted. Again, input output is just to make input equal output. Virtual mix rack here, I went with a piano. I made some changes. Same low cut here. I didn't do anything in this EQ, but I did something over here. At 160, there's also a sweet spot here. But because we're like panned far right most of the time with the organ, I said, fine, it's not going to clash with, I think it was the swirl I had done the same cut. The rest of it at around 7.5, I did a similar kind of move in terms of bringing those frequencies up. Now I do a high pass at 80-ish hertz. 80-ish here means, I want to leave some room for bass. I want to take out some of the just low-end blondness from this organ so it sits nicer in the mix. And again, you mix in context because I wouldn't have made this move unless I listened to it. Because intuitively speaking, I might want that if I'm just listening to an organ by itself. But in the context of the mix, it just made things kind of murky and I didn't care for it. So here I did some dialing around the natural keys on this distressor and same kind of pattern, the gain reduction. We didn't want as heavy. We added a little bit of shimmer, a little bit of thickness. That was fine. And then we trimmed so that in would equal out. Same exact move with the iZone Imager 2. I want this to be wide in the mix because you can tell the difference with it and without it. Here's what we're going to do here then. We solo the organ and let's do it with and without the Imager 2 and you'll be able to tell right away. Here we go. Here's it with, now without. Now with. It just adds that little bit of stuff, and I really like the way it's set in the mix. But now what's this organ wide? So our friend the repeater, which is part of Slade, although it's produced by someone else, same kind of principle. But what I wanted to do here is I wanted the left and right. I wanted some latency on the right. I mean, there's some latency on the left, but I wanted half the amount of latency on the right. So you're just going to get this width on the organ. So let's listen to it with, I guess pun intended, and without. Here we go. This is without. And here's with. So you hear some echoing and all that, but it's with the time, so I didn't mind it so much. I actually thought it was cool when you listen to the whole thing in context. One more time. All right, so there was one part of the song that I thought was awesome. I didn't see it coming the first couple times I listened to it, and I really liked it, and I wanted to do something with it because when you make musical decisions that take some people's performances out, it's tough, right? Because you want everyone to be heard. But here, I had the opportunity, given what I'm calling the breakdown, there are a lengthy series of solos, and I decided to showcase each player in the solo and the best performed part by each of them. So let's get into that, and then we're going to get into automation briefly, just to show you what I did to maintain a level, maintain coolness based on performance, and what's really the dominant voice in the song and what works for the song. But at some points, you have to make decisions around muting elements and featuring elements by way of volume in the mix. So let's listen to the breakdown and into the solo a little bit, and then I'll stop and walk through, what I did automation wise. Here we go. Okay, so you start hearing people come in, the dominant part is playing solos. I really like the part of the song because then it comes back into the catchy chorus. And this song totally makes sense to me. I enjoyed working on it immensely. But what you see here, and let me zoom way out, okay? You see these lines here. Every DAW does this, whether it's Studio One or Logic or Pro Tools or whatever. What I want to do is be able to draw some things in. Here we see volume and drums in general. There were a couple of quirky parts. There's this weird woo sound you hear with the drums. I caught on to it when I listened to the raw mix from the band, the reference mix from the band. And I thought, yeah, I want to feature this a little bit. So I drew in volume there. But otherwise, drums, I didn't attenuate the volume through automation at all. The drums played very solidly throughout the song. I captured all the elements of the drums already in these buses. So I said, yeah, let's not go overboard. They're driving the song. They're in the pocket. We've captured the neat stuff that's going on with the hi-hats. We've captured a ton of the attack. And we've given the drums some life by adding some room to it. The bass itself, here we see volume. You have options for anything in any DAW, like a pan, but I didn't use that because bass is pan dead center. So I didn't automate it, no need. Mute, the bass played the whole song. We didn't play with that. But what I realized as I listened to these various parts on these songs that are all marked here, and all the DAWs do markers in a very similar way, where you put a marker in a certain place, you give it a name, and that's it. Um, I just made the volume at certain parts for bass louder than others because sometimes some of the instruments were lower than others, and I felt it conflicted with the bass. Sometimes, if we're talking about this eerie sound, which is here, eerie sound is higher in frequency, and when the eerie is doing a solo in parts, the bass is higher than it is in other parts and lower as it is in other parts. Um, these other instruments you see here, these are all musical decisions. You see in certain parts here, you see the swirl bus, and you see that the volume is completely zero, right? You see as I mouse over these various uh, automation points on this automation chart or graph or whatever you want to call it, volume is totally taken out. And if we just scroll down through these various automation pieces, you can see I drew in similar automation around the wideness. So when the swirl sound is not as aggressive as other times, you want the automation for that wide bus to follow suit. Same goes for the Erie bus. And you'll see places where, this is completely taken out of the picture or mostly taken out of the picture. And other instruments, the curves are higher when this is cut out. This is all a musical choice. Every DAW, like I said, supports this stuff. But there are some neat is probably a word I use way too often. I had talked about how some of these channels, like the Erie left and the Erie right, this one is muted or not muted. What I found was that at certain parts of the song, I wanted to play both channels. It was a musical choice based on what serves the song. And as you hear, for example, I'll take the swirl as an example because there's a swirl solo, and you see that right here. If we take a look at panning itself, or you take a look at mute itself, in this case, you'll see that there are fundamental changes that are made at certain parts of the song. So here, mute is up all the way until the swirl solo happens. And then I said, yeah, I really like this, the way it sounds, but I don't want it just coming out of one channel. I want both channels. I want to set volume appropriately for left and right channels with having a balanced mix in mind. But I'm going to bring up this right channel temporarily during the solo just because it sounds good, it's a good performance, and to my ears at least, it suited the song. So here we go. And listen to the pan. It's subtle, right? Just put enough level into it, but you can hear it panning left and right. I think it's a great idea. And that's that, really. Not a ton to talk about regarding automation. Automation is all like once you figure out and you work through this workflow and you draw these markers to understand where you are in the song. The real question is, what are the dominant elements? How am I filling in the parts? And in the end, I think this is pretty cohesive. I mean, I'm waiting on more feedback from the band, and we're going to meet up on a Zoom in a couple of weeks just to talk through this. But I hope this was useful. And I hope that, if you're interested in mixing and music production, and it's a passion, it's something that I prefer to do than watching television. It's a way I love to spend time. I love to be involved with music, although I don't play in bands anymore, really. Although I don't get to play as much as I want anymore, really. This is my way to help someone showcase their work is the best way I can put it. So I hope you enjoyed this. Please feel free to leave feedback, and the Noopy is out.